Natasha,
Hi,
good
Lori.
morning and congratulations on the
Thank
publication of
you.
your
Thank you so
Interface. I'm so excited to see your book in print. Um, it does such a beautiful job of helping the reader to get to know the women you've interviewed, but also then moving out to see um, the broader implications of their experiences. And so, as always, it's very fine scholarship. We get a sense of the personalities of the women you've talked to, but again, also the ways in which their lives are implicated in the law and the broader societies around them. I had a few questions as a result of reading the book and just thinking about your work in general, and wanting to maybe just ask you a few questions that would pick up on some of the themes in the book, but perhaps give you an opportunity to push a little further and to help us to understand the relevance of the work that you've done in the contemporary context. And so, the first question that I had for you on this was if you could maybe just talk about what are the harms of laws that ban the niqab? What are the harms done by attempts to legally regulate niqab wearing women?
Okay, thanks, Lori, for that question. Um, so the harms of niqab bans, and I'll start with the harms to niqab wearing women themselves, are really numerous. Depending on the type of ban, they can affect a whole variety of rights. So perhaps what I'll do is limit my remarks to the type of ban that's currently enacted in Quebec, that prohibits niqab wearing women from working in the public service and receiving public services. So first off, the ability to earn a living and have some economic autonomy gives women the freedom to make choices. And that includes choices that are contrary to the wishes of the people who might be closest to these women. So niqab bans of the kind in Quebec really reduce the economic agency of religious women. And contrary to some people's views that niqab wearing women cannot or do not work outside of the home, many niqab wearing women need to work in order to provide for their families. Second, because women continue to be the primary caregivers for children, the elderly, people who are ill, people who have disabilities, they're going to be acutely impacted by Quebec's law that an individual must show her face in order to receive access to daycare services, for example, public retirement homes, public therapeutic services, hospitals, not to mention transportation to get to these services. Third, by limiting access to public transportation, important health and social services, niqab wearing women are going to be much more isolated. So niqab bans hamper women's movement, their free movement, their ability to access friends, family, social supports, and that leaves them isolated and then vulnerable to violence and abuse that we know that women of all backgrounds in Canada are vulnerable to. Then there's the denial of multiple levels of educational services, and how that can affect the long-term prospects of niqab-wearing women. So access to education is widely recognized as integral to fostering gender equality, the alleviation of poverty. Having an education plays a pivotal, a transformative role in the empowerment of women, their ability to earn an income. It reduces poverty. It increases the likelihood of just living a healthy life. And of course, it's an essential tool in their personal development, equipping women with the capacity to just claim and exercise autonomy. Specifically for immigrant women in the Quebec context, learning the French language is a valuable path to gender equality. And we know that several niqab-wearing women were prevented from taking French language courses. And this actually happened even before the enactment of the legal prohibition of covering your face. So that's a significant disadvantage in a primarily French-speaking province that's going to restrict many of the prospects for niqab-wearing women. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, by enacting legislation that promotes distrust and animosity toward a specific group, niqab bans condone the segregation, the marginalization, and the exclusion of this minority of women. And it creates an atmosphere in which they are subject to harassment and violence as they occupy just public spaces. And that kind of street violence really compromises religious women's, obviously their physical safety, but also their mental health and their ability to enjoy rights and freedoms on an equal basis. Ordinary people seem to feel emboldened by legislation like this, and they seem to act like vigilante police, taking it upon themselves to enforce the law on these women. Finally, so I think what I'll just talk about very briefly are the implications of niqab bans for those other than niqab-wearing women. And that's really, I'll just say very simply that I think a worldview that's organized in terms of simple binaries of good, bad, civilized, backward, that's really risky. And it leaves very little room for self-criticism. No, open ourselves. We want to live together in the diverse environment that we live in a way that's meaningful and peaceful. So forgive me for the long-winded response, but niqab bans really do have far-reaching implications.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for that, the comprehensive response. I think it's important to be able to identify all of the harms, and you've done that very well just now, but also in the book, you certainly articulate those extremely well. I do always puzzle about how it is that it's possible to ignore these harms, and how it is that people can simply just sweep them away. And I'm wondering then how it is that maybe the banning or the legal regulation of niqabs in one form, how that relates of hierarchy, religion, and the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question. You know, as a legal scholar, I am certainly interested in how law can be used as a tool for advancing the interests of marginalized groups, and I include in that women, racialized people, people from all sorts of minority communities. You know, sometimes social and political movements like feminism that have theoretically emancipatory goals can be myopic in their approach to liberation. And they are myopic, I would say, because they view their subjects or their constituents too narrowly. So, for example, the differences between women based on race or based on religion in order to really insist on the primacy of gender as a site for oppression. And this lack of an intersectional analysis, what it does is it posits white women as the main subjects of feminism. And of course, it renders invisible the issues that are of concern to minority women, such as Muslim women. So I kind of prefer a feminist intersectional approach to legal issues because I feel it offers a more robust understanding of how to advance social justice while also really revealing the limitations of law, because of course there are limitations to law. So those in favor of legally prohibiting niqabs will typically understand gender equality in a very limited way. Niqab is necessarily an oppressive item of clothing that women are forced to wear by male members of their families, for example. And of course, that's entirely contrary to what niqab-wearing women tell us, based on research done from at least 6 different liberal democracies. So a vision of gender equality that does not also advance the religious interests of Muslim women is, I would say, problematic. It suggests that there's really only one way in which to live a fulfilling life as a woman, and it doesn't take into account equality and faith. And you know, that type of thinking results in the legal regulation of certain women's clothing, which, if you think about it, is kind of appalling. You know, why is the state ever in the business of telling women what to wear? So where gender equality, and that to a very particular understanding of gender equality, is touted as the most important right or the overriding right, women from minority communities, racialized women, religious women, you know, they've told us that that is really misapprehending their lived realities. I guess, I mean, the other concern with the over-policing of Muslim women's attire is that it takes the focus away from other really important questions that we might be thinking about in terms of gender equality in our culture. So it shores up this idea that we have resolved in our culture all issues involving gender equality, and we know that it's much more complicated than that. We know that women still earn less than men for work of equal value. We know is rampant, you know, to name just a couple of issues. I can give you one other example, and that's, I'm thinking about the sexual assault context. You know, thanks to the efforts of many feminists, we understand now that, and we have reformed our laws such that inquiring into what a woman wore when she was sexually assaulted, we know that that's not appropriate. And it's not appropriate because it perpetuates myths and stereotypes about the kind of woman that she is, the likelihood of her being raped. Okay, but law has somehow declared that a Muslim sexual assault complainant has to remove her niqab while testifying in court, and that that's okay, even though all of the social science evidence really indicates that seeing her face is not going to give the decision maker valuable information. So forcing a woman to remove her usual clothing in court, I would say, is going to produce perverse results. It's going to intimidate Muslim women, make them less likely to want to report their sexual assaults. And we know that sexual assaults are already very underreported, that it's an offense with very low conviction rates. And I think it sends the message that Muslim women who wear niqabs, that as a society, we care less about them. So advancing niqab-wearing women's interests helps us to see structural inequalities much more broadly. It helps us take into account all women's rights. It reveals a more understanding pressure. I think those most marginalized, and I would suggest niqab-wearing women are one of those groups, it helps us to improve institutions for everybody.